Before the wall, before the night's watch, before the very concept of winter as men know it, there was darkness. And in that darkness, something stirred. The long night stands as perhaps the most catastrophic event in the recorded history of the known world, a period so devastating that it carved itself into the collective memory of cultures separated by thousands of leagues of land and sea. Yet, for all the songs sung and tales told, for all the pages penned by maesters in their citadels, the truth of what happened during those terrible years remains shrouded in the mists of time. What we know is fragmentary, pieced together from legends that have been passed down through countless generations, each telling shaped by the fears and beliefs of those who kept the stories alive. To understand the long night, we must first understand the world that came before it, the world it destroyed. 8,000 years before Aegon's conquest, give or take a millennium, for the dates grow uncertain the further back we peer, Westeros was a vastly different place. This was the Age of Heroes, a time when great men and women walked the earth and performed deeds that would echo through the ages. Yet, it was also a time of conflict, of uneasy peace, and of powers that modern men can scarcely comprehend. The first men had long since crossed the land bridge, known as the Arm of Dawn, bringing with them bronze weapons, horses, and a hunger for land. Their arrival had been catastrophic for the children of the forest, those small, mysterious beings who had inhabited Westeros since time immemorial. The first men cut down the weirwood trees, those ancient white-barked sentinels with faces carved into their trunks, and the children saw this as more than mere deforestation. It was an assault on their gods, on the very fabric of their world. The war between the first men and the children had been brutal and strange. The children, though small in stature and few in number, possessed powers that the first men could barely comprehend. They called upon the earth itself to split open, wielding the magic of the old gods through their greenseers, those among them who could see through the eyes of animals and peer into the past and future through the weirwood trees. The maesters speak of how the children used their powers to shatter the Arm of Dawn, breaking the land bridge that had allowed the first men to cross, drowning thousands in the attempt to isolate the invaders. Some accounts claim they tried to do the same at the neck, to separate the north from the south. But the magic was not strong enough, leaving only the swamps and bogs that make that region nearly impassable to this day. Yet, for all their power, the children couldn't stand against the tide of humanity. The first men were too numerous, too determined, and too willing to adapt. They learned the land, they spread across the continent, and slowly but surely they pushed the children back into the deepest forests, the darkest caves, the places where the weirwood still grew thick and the old magic remained strong. The conflict might have continued until the children were utterly destroyed, but both sides grew weary of the bloodshed. On the Isle of Faces, in the God's Eye, a great lake in the Riverlands, where the weirwoods grew so dense that their white branches formed a canopy that blocked out the sun, the first men and the children made their pact. The terms were simple, but profound. The first men would take the open lands, the coasts, the plains, the valleys, but they would leave the forests to the children. They would cease cutting down the weirwood trees and would honor the old gods alongside whatever deities they brought with them. To seal this agreement, every tree on the Isle of Faces was carved with a face, so that the gods themselves might bear witness to the oath. And for thousands of years the pact held. This was the world into which the long night would eventually descend, a world of tentative peace between two very different peoples, a world where men were expanding their settlements and building their halls of grey stone, where heroes rose and fell, where the first great houses began to establish themselves in the regions they would rule for millennia to come. The North in those days was a realm unto itself, more separate from the southern kingdoms than it would be even in later ages. The kings of winter ruled from Winterfell, though whether the castle stood in the same form as it does now, no one can say with certainty. Brandon the Builder would later become famous for constructing the wall, but the Starks were already ancient, already tied to the land and the old gods in ways that other houses were not. Some whispered even then that the blood of the first men ran purest in the Starks, that they had taken something from the children when the pact was made, gifts that manifested in strange ways. South of the north, other kingdoms rose. The Marsh kings ruled the neck from their seat at Moat Cailin before that fortress fell to ruin. The Barrow kings held sway over the land that would become the Barrowlands. On the Iron Islands, the Ironborn were already reaving and raiding, worshipping their drowned god and taking thralls from the mainland. In the Reach, in the Stormlands, in the mountains of the Vale, men built their holdfasts and their kingdoms, each generation adding another layer to the tapestry of Westerosi civilization. But always, in the far north, beyond even the furthest settlements of the first men, lay the lands of always winter. No one knew what lay in those frozen wastes. Even the wildlings, those free folk who refused to kneel to southern kings, rarely ventured that far north. The land grew colder the further one travelled, until the very air seemed to freeze in the lungs. Great mountains of ice thrust up towards the sky, glittering in the weak sunlight. Nothing grew there. Nothing lived there, or so it was believed. The children of the forest knew differently. In their caves and hollow hills, in the sacred groves where the weirwoods grew thickest, the greenseers would sometimes wake from their visions with terror in their eyes. They spoke of things glimpsed in the far north, of presences that should not be, of a cold that was more than mere cold. But these warnings, if they were given, were not heeded. Or, perhaps, they were dismissed as the fever dreams of those who spent too long in the strange fugue state that greenseeing required. The exact relationship between the first men and the children during this period remains a matter of some debate among Meisters. Some accounts suggest that after the pact, the two peoples lived in relative harmony, occasionally intermingling at the edges of their territories, sharing knowledge and customs. The first men learned to carve faces into the weirwoods and to pray before heart trees, adopting the gods of the children as their own. Some even say that certain humans were taught the secrets of Greensight, though whether this is true or merely legend is impossible to verify. Others maintain that the peace was more fragile than the tales suggest, that there remained deep wells of mistrust on both sides, that the children never fully forgave the first men for the trees that had been cut and the land that had been taken. In this version of events, the pact was less a true reconciliation and more a truce born of necessity, with both sides watching the other warily across the boundaries they had established. What we do know is that the population of the children was already declining. Whether from the losses sustained in the war, from some other cause, or simply because their kind were not meant to thrive in a world increasingly dominated by men, their numbers dwindled with each passing century. They retreated further into the deep forests, into the cave systems beneath the earth, into places where humans rarely ventured. Some say they were fading even then, slowly disappearing from the world like morning mist beneath the sun. The first men, by contrast, were thriving. They built more settlements, cleared more land, raised more children. Their kingdoms grew stronger and more established. They developed new techniques for working bronze, and, eventually, iron, when knowledge of its forging reached Westeros from Essos across the narrow sea. They bred horses stronger and faster than those their ancestors had ridden across the arm of Dorne. They became, in short, the dominant force in Westeros, and the Age of Heroes reached its zenith. It was into this world, a world of expanding human civilization, of declining children of the forest, of ancient magic slowly fading before the advance of iron and agriculture, that the long night would eventually fall. But before it came, before the darkness descended and the cold crept south to freeze the very seas, there had to be a beginning. Something had to happen in those frozen wastes beyond the edge of the known world. Some event, some decision, some terrible mistake or deliberate act had to set in motion the catastrophe that would nearly destroy all of human civilization. The Meisters have their theories, recorded in their dustiest tomes in the Citadel's deepest libraries. Old Nan had her tales, told to frighten children on cold winter nights. The wildlings have their own versions, passed down through oral tradition in the lands beyond where the wall would one day stand. And far to the east, in Yitai and Ashai and other distant lands, they have their own accounts of what they call the Long Night, though whether it was truly the same event, or merely a period of unusual darkness and cold, is a matter of debate. What all these accounts agree on is this. Something emerged from the far north, something that brought with it a winter that lasted a generation, a darkness that swallowed the sun, and a terror unlike anything the world had seen before or since. The White Walkers were coming, but the people of Westeros did not know this yet. They could not have imagined what was stirring in the frozen waste, what ancient power was awakening or being awakened, what force was about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. They went about their lives, building, farming, fighting in their petty wars, raising their children, growing old and dying, unaware that everything was about to change. In the north, in those last seasons before the darkness fell, there were signs, or so the stories claim. The summers grew shorter and the winters longer. The cold bit deeper than it had in living memory. Animals behaved strangely, fleeing south in greater numbers than usual. The wildlings reported odd occurrences beyond their settlements, sounds in the night, mysterious disappearances, a sense of wrongness in the air. But these were the lands beyond civilization, places where superstition ran deep and every shadow held a possible threat. Who could say whether these reports were genuine warnings or merely the usual fears of people living on the edge of the world? The first men had grown comfortable in their kingdoms. The wars with the children were ancient history, the pact was holding, and life had settled into the rhythms of agriculture and lordship. Even in the north, where the old ways ran deepest and the memory of ancient threats lingered longest, there was no real preparation for what was coming. How could there be? No one alive had ever faced such a threat. No one could have imagined it. And so the world turned, the seasons changed, and in the lands of always winter, something that had been sleeping, or something that had been created, began to move. The age of heroes was ending, though no one knew it yet. The long night was beginning, and with it would come a test of survival that would push humanity and the children of the forest to the very brink of extinction. But the true question, the mystery that has haunted scholars and storytellers for 18,000 years, is this. What were the White Walkers? Where did they come from? Were they some natural force, some ancient evil that had always existed in the frozen north, waiting for the right moment to emerge? Or were they something else, something created, perhaps even something made with purpose, by those who would soon find themselves fighting desperately for survival against their own creation? The answer to that question lies in the events that would soon unfold, in the desperate measures taken by a dying people, in magic unleashed without full understanding of its consequences. But that part of the story is yet to come. For now, we stand at the threshold, looking out over a world about to be transformed by ice and darkness and death. A world where the warm halls and hearth fires of human civilization are about to seem very fragile indeed against the cold that is coming. The age before dawn was ending, and in the ending, as in all endings, there was both loss and the seeds of what would come after, if anything would come after at all. The children of the forest were dying, not quickly, not in the sudden violence of battle, or the swift taking of plague, but slowly, inexorably, like a candle burning down to its last finger of wax. The pact had brought peace, yes, but it had also brought something the children had not fully anticipated: irrelevance. The forests they had been promised were shrinking with each generation as the first men's population grew, and their need for farmland expanded. The old gods were still worshipped, the weirwoods still carved with their watching faces, but the connection between the children and the land was weakening. Their magic, once so potent that they could shatter continents, was fading like morning frost beneath a rising sun. The Greenseers saw it most clearly. Through their visions, peering into the countless possible futures that branched and twisted like the roots of the weirwoods themselves, they saw their people vanishing from the world. In some timelines, they faded peacefully, becoming nothing more than legend and shadow. In others, they were hunted down and destroyed when the pact finally broke, as many feared it eventually would. But in all the futures the Greenseers could perceive, the outcome was the same. The children of the forest would not survive. All save one possibility, one dark, desperate path. The first men continued to press northward, despite the pact, despite the agreements carved into every tree on the Isle of Faces. Human ambition knew no true boundaries. They wanted the timber of the northern forests. They wanted the game that dwelt there. They wanted the land, always more land, to sustain their growing numbers. And what could the children do? Fight another war. They had barely survived the first one, and now they were fewer still, their magic dimmer, their ability to wage war all but extinguished. In the deepest parts of the far north, in places where the weirwoods grew so ancient that their trunks were wider than a giant's height, and their roots delved deeper than any mine shaft, the most powerful Greenseers gathered. These were the last of the truly mighty among their kind, those whose powers had not yet faded with the dying of their race. They came together in a sacred grove, a place where the heart of the forest beat strongest, where the old magic still flowed through the earth like blood through veins. What was said in that gathering no human record can tell. The maesters can only speculate, piecing together fragments from the oldest tales, from the whispered legends that the children themselves, those few who survived, shared in later ages with those humans they deemed worthy of trust. But the broad strokes of what happened are known, for the children themselves eventually spoke of it, their voices heavy with regret and horror at what they had done. They had debated their course through what might have been days or weeks. Time moved differently in those deep places where the magic was strong. Some argued for retreat, for withdrawing even further north, to the places where the first men would not follow, where the cold was too bitter and the land too barren for human habitation. Others counselled patience, arguing that the pact would hold, that the first men would respect the boundaries that had been set. Still, others advocated for war, hopeless though it might be, arguing that it was better to die fighting than to fade away into nothing. But there was another faction, led by the most ancient and most powerful of the Greenseers. They spoke of a different path, one that had appeared in their visions like a dark thread winding through all the possible futures. A way to defend the forests forever, to create a guardian so powerful that the first men would be driven back, that humanity would learn to fear the deep places and never again encroach upon the children's domain. They spoke of weaponizing the very force that had always been the children's greatest enemy, the cold. In the far north, beyond even where the wildlings dared to roam, the lands of always winter had existed since the world was young. No one knew why that region was so frozen, why the ice never melted even in the height of summer, why the cold there seemed almost alive, almost sentient in its hunger. The children had always avoided those wastes, sensing something fundamentally wrong about them, something antithetical to the life and growth that the old gods represented. But, in their desperation, the Greenseers began to study that cold, to peer into its nature with their powers, and they discovered something that filled them with both hope and dread. The cold was indeed alive, after a fashion. Not alive as the trees were alive, or as animals were alive, but a different kind of existence, ancient and patient and hungry. It was a force that could be shaped, channeled, even bound into a physical form, if one had the power and the knowledge to do so. The cost of such magic would be terrible. The Greenseers knew this. They saw it in their visions, saw the blood price that would have to be paid, saw the consequences that would ripple outward from the act like waves from a stone thrown into a still pond. But they also saw their people vanishing from the world, saw the forests burning, saw the weirwoods toppled and carved into lumber for human halls. Faced with extinction, they chose the dark path. The ritual itself would require a human subject. This was non-negotiable, for the magic the children sought to work required the very thing they hoped to defend against, the essence of humanity itself. The Greenseers understood, in the way that those who work with deep magic understand, that the most powerful sorceries often demand a terrible symmetry. To create a weapon against humans, they would need to transform a human into something else, something that retained enough of what it had been to understand and hunt its former kind, but changed so fundamentally that it would be other, forever separate from the humanity it had known. How the children obtained their subject, the records do not clearly state. Some tales suggest it was a prisoner from the wars, kept alive for this purpose. Others claim it was a volunteer from among the first men who had integrated with the children, someone who had come to worship the old gods so devoutly that they were willing to sacrifice everything for their adopted people. Still others whisper darker possibilities, that it was a greenseer's own child, born of a union between a child of the forest and one of the first men, possessing blood of both races. What is known, what was shown in visions granted to certain greenseers in later ages, is this. They brought the subject to a heart tree in that sacred grove, to the oldest and most powerful weirwood in all the forest. Its face was carved with features that seemed to shift and change in the light, sometimes appearing sorrowful, sometimes angry, sometimes utterly alien and incomprehensible. Its roots spread out like a vast web beneath the earth, connecting to every other weirwood in the north, creating a network through which the greenseers could see and communicate across vast distances. The subject was bound to the tree, though whether with ropes or with magic, or simply with the certainty of fate, none can say. The most powerful greenseers surrounded the heart tree, their small forms barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the ancient branches. They began to chant in their own tongue words that had never been spoken by human lips, syllables that seemed to make the very air shimmer and distort. And then one of them stepped forward, holding in their small hands a shard of dragonglass, obsidian, black as a moonless night, sharp as any blade ever forged. This was no ordinary dragonglass, but a piece that had been prepared with rituals and soaked in the blood of sacred animals, charged with power drawn from the earth itself through the roots of the weirwoods. The greenseer drove the dragonglass into the subject's chest, directly over the heart. What happened next defies easy description, for it was witnessed only by the children themselves, and when they spoke of it in later times, their words were inadequate to capture the horror of what they had done. The subject's scream was said to have echoed through every weirwood in the north simultaneously, causing birds to take flight and animals to flee in terror. The transformation was not instantaneous, but neither was it slow. It was a process of unmaking and remaking, of taking a human being and reshaping them into something that had never existed before. The cold from the lands of always winter, that ancient, hungry cold, was channeled through the dragonglass, through the weirwood, and into the subject's body. It flooded through their veins, replacing blood with ice, warmth with an eternal winter. Their eyes, whatever color they had been before, turned blue, a brilliant, glowing blue like the heart of a glacier, like frozen lightning. Their skin grew pale and tight, taking on a sheen like frost on glass, and the cold radiated from them, a palpable wave of freezing air that made even the children, accustomed to all seasons, draw back in fear and awe. But it was not merely a physical transformation. The subject's mind, their very soul, if such a thing exists, was altered as well. The humanity was not entirely erased. That would have defeated the purpose. But it was twisted, frozen, locked away behind walls of ice and alien purpose. What emerged was something that remembered being human in the way one might remember a half-forgotten dream, but that now existed in a state so fundamentally different that humanity was like a distant shore glimpsed through fog. The first White Walker rose from where they had been bound, and the greenseers who had created them understood immediately that they had made a terrible mistake. The creature that stood before them was indeed powerful, perhaps more powerful than they had imagined. The cold that emanated from it was not natural winter, but something far more profound, a cold that could freeze living flesh in moments, that could shatter steel and turn blood to ice in the veins. More than that, they sensed in this being a kind of intelligence, a consciousness that was no longer bound by the limitations of human thought, that perceived the world in ways the children themselves could barely comprehend. But the crucial, fatal flaw in their working became apparent almost immediately. They had no control over what they had created. The White Walker did not bow to the children. It did not acknowledge their authority or accept their commands. It simply stood there in the grove, regarding them with those glowing blue eyes. And in that gaze was something that chilled the Greenseers more deeply than any winter wind, recognition of their nature as living things, as creatures of warmth and blood, as prey. The children fled that grove, and the first White Walker did not pursue them. Not then. It had other purposes, though what those purposes were, whether they were imposed by the nature of its creation, or whether it possessed true free will, has been debated by scholars ever since. What is certain is that it did not remain alone for long. The White Walkers, the others, as they came to be called in the tongues of men, possessed the ability to create more of their kind. Not through reproduction as humans, or even as the children did, but through transformation. They could take human subjects, and it had to be humans, never the children, as if the magic recognized and rejected its creators, and remake them in their own image. The exact mechanism of this transformation was never fully understood, but it involved that same terrible cold, that same remaking of the essence of a living being into something other. And so the first walker went out from that sacred grove into the lands of always winter, and there it began to gather others to itself. Whether it captured humans who had ventured too far north, or whether there were already other subjects prepared by the children in a desperate attempt to correct their mistake by creating a force they could control, none can say with certainty. But one walker became two, and two became four, and the number grew. The children, realizing the magnitude of their error, attempted to stop what they had started. The same Greenseers who had performed the original ritual tried to unmake it, to reach through the weirwood network and undo the transformation they had wrought. But the magic would not respond. The cold they had channeled was not something that could be easily dismissed or controlled once it had been given form and purpose. The dragonglass shard, still embedded in that first walker's chest, or so the legends claim, had become something more than mere obsidian. It was a vessel, a battery of sorts, holding and channeling power beyond the children's ability to contain. Some accounts suggest that the children sent warriors to destroy the White Walkers in those early days, before they grew too numerous. If this is true, those warriors did not return. The cold was too strong, the walkers too powerful, and perhaps most significantly, too intelligent. These weren't mindless beasts to be hunted down and destroyed. They were something far more dangerous, thinking beings with purpose, with the ability to plan and strategize, with an understanding of warfare that seemed to come from the human memories locked within their frozen forms. The children retreated deeper into their forests, back to the lands south of where the walkers had emerged, and they waited. They watched through the eyes of the weirwoods, through the visions of their Greenseers, as their creation grew in power and number. They saw the White Walkers organizing themselves into some semblance of society, if such a word could be applied to their alien existence. They saw them creating weapons from the ice itself, swords and spears that glittered like frozen starlight, so cold that they could shatter steel upon contact. And they saw the first signs of what would eventually become the long night's greatest horror, the dead rising to serve the White Walkers. Whether this power was inherent in the magic that created the Walkers, or whether it was something they discovered through experimentation, the ability to animate the dead and command them as an army was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the threat the children had unleashed. A single White Walker might be killed, possibly, if one had the right weapons and the will to face that terrible cold. But a White Walker commanding hundreds or thousands of whites, of risen corpses that felt no pain and no fear and no mercy, that was a force that could overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers. The children of the forest had sought to create a guardian, a weapon to defend their forests against human expansion. Instead, they had created an existential threat, not just to humanity, but to all living things. The supreme irony of their situation was not lost on them. In their desperate attempt to save themselves from the first men, they had created something that would very nearly destroy both races utterly. But the worst was yet to come. For the White Walkers, having established themselves in the lands of always winter, having grown in number and power, having learned the extent of their abilities, did not remain content to dwell in those frozen wastes. The cold that animated them, that formed the core of their being, had a hunger to it. It sought to spread, to consume the warmth of the world, to freeze and still all living things. The White Walkers began to move south, and when they did, when they brought with them that unnatural winter and the army of the dead and the darkness that seemed to swallow the very sun, the long night truly began. The children of the forest, those who had made this terrible mistake, would have to face the consequences of their actions. More than that, they would have to do something they had never imagined they would do again. They would have to seek alliance with the first men, the very people they had sought to defend against, because the alternative was extinction for all. But could humanity and the children unite against a threat that neither fully understood? Could they stand against the cold that was coming, against the darkness that would soon descend? And most pressing of all, could the creators find a way to destroy what they had made, or would their desperate act of self-preservation become the instrument of their own annihilation? The answers would come in blood and ice and darkness, in a war that would last a generation and nearly extinguish all life in Westeros. But first, the world had to learn what terror truly meant. They had to witness the darkness descending, had to see their loved ones fall and rise again as enemies, had to understand that everything they knew about death and winter had been merely preparation for this, for the long night that was now upon them. The first settlements to fall did so in silence. This, perhaps, was the most unnerving aspect of the early days of the long night. Not the screams of battle or the clash of arms, but the utter absence of sound that followed the White Walkers' passage. Villages that had stood for generations, that had survived harsh winters and wildling raids and all the natural dangers of living in the far north, simply went quiet. Traders who travelled the established routes between these settlements would arrive to find doors standing open, hearth fires cold, meals left half-eaten on tables, and not a soul to be found, living or dead. At first, these disappearances were attributed to wildling attacks or to people fleeing some natural disaster. The north was a harsh land, and communities sometimes failed. It happened. But as the incidents multiplied, as more and more settlements vanished without trace, a pattern began to emerge that filled those who noticed it with a dread they could not quite name. The disappearances were moving south. The wildlings were the first to truly understand what was happening, for they lived closest to the source of the threat. The free folk, as they called themselves, had always dwelt beyond the reach of southern kings, in the lands north of where the wall would one day stand. They were a hardy people, accustomed to the cold and the dangers of the wild, suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely independent. They did not kneel, they did not bow, and they did not frighten easily. But they were frightened now. The stories that began to filter south from the free folk spoke of things that seemed impossible, of horrors that defied belief. They spoke of the cold, not the familiar cold of even the harshest winter, but a cold that moved like a living thing, that crept forward with purpose and malevolence. A cold that could freeze a man solid in moments, that turned flesh brittle as glass and shattered bone with a touch. They spoke of shapes glimpsed in the darkness, tall figures that moved with an eerie grace that seemed to glide across the snow without leaving tracks, whose very presence made the air itself freeze and fall as tiny crystals of ice. And they spoke of the dead. This was the detail that caused even hardened warriors to shake their heads in disbelief, that made the lords in their stone halls dismiss these tales as the ravings of terrified savages. The dead, the wildlings claimed, were walking. Those who fell to the cold or to the strange figures that brought it did not stay fallen. They rose again, their eyes now glowing with the same terrible blue light as their masters, and they marched south in a growing army of the slain. The first recorded encounter between the White Walkers and a force prepared for battle, insofar as any force could be prepared for what they were about to face, occurred at a wildling settlement whose name has been lost to time. It was a substantial community by the standards of the free folk, perhaps 300 people strong, nestled in a valley where the hunting was good, and the land provided some shelter from the worst of the northern winds. They had received warnings from scouts, from survivors of other settlements who had fled south with tales of the approaching threat. The settlement's leader, a woman remembered only as the Red Crow for the colour of her hair and the fierceness of her nature, had rallied her people to defend their homes. They prepared weapons, set watches, built bonfires around the perimeter of the settlement to provide light and warmth. They were as ready as anyone could be for an enemy they did not fully understand. The White Walkers came at twilight, in that uncertain hour when the day dies and the night is not yet fully born. The temperature had been dropping for days, but when the walkers arrived, the cold that came with them was something else entirely. The bonfires that the wildlings had built flickered and dimmed, their flames turning blue and weak. The very air seemed to crystallize, and with each breath, the defenders felt ice forming in their lungs. Out of the growing darkness came the White Walkers, and for the first time, humans saw clearly what the children of the forest had created. They were tall, taller than any man, with a terrible beauty to their forms. Their skin was pale as milk, translucent almost, and patterns seemed to move beneath it, like frost spreading across glass. They wore armor of ice that gleamed in the dying light, and they carried weapons that seemed forged from winter itself, swords and spears of crystalline ice that gave off a cold blue radiance. But it was their eyes that broke the first line of defense. Those glowing blue eyes, bright as stars and cold as the void between them, held an intelligence that was profoundly alien and deeply terrifying. These weren't beasts or mindless monsters. These were thinking beings, and in their gaze was something that might have been contempt for the warm-blooded creatures scrambling to defend themselves. The Red Crow, to her credit, did not flee. She screamed her defiance and charged, her people following behind her with weapons raised. They crashed into the line of White Walkers like a wave against a cliff, and what happened next would be told and retold around campfires for generations to come, each telling trying to capture the horror of that first true battle. Steel weapons, forged in the fires of human smiths and wielded by warriors who had survived countless battles, shattered like glass upon contact with the walkers' blades. The ice swords passed through iron and bronze, and even the rare pieces of steel armor as if they were cloth, and where they touched flesh, that flesh froze instantly. Warriors fell with limbs turned to ice, their blood crystallizing in their veins before they hit the ground. But the wildlings learned something crucial in those desperate moments. The White Walkers could be harmed. Fire, when it could be brought to bear, made the creatures recoil. And the few weapons of dragonglass that the settlement possessed, relics from ancient times that had been kept more for their beauty than their utility, proved devastatingly effective. When dragonglass met the flesh of a White Walker, the creature shattered, exploding into shards of ice that scattered across the frozen ground with a sound like breaking crystal. The Red Crow herself managed to drive a dragonglass dagger into one of the walkers, and her people cheered as they watched the creature come apart before their eyes. But their victory was short-lived. When a White Walker shattered, something else happened, something that filled the survivors with even greater despair. All the whites that particular walker had raised, all the dead that it commanded, collapsed as well, returning to true death. This should have been heartening, proof that the enemy could be defeated. But it also meant that the force arrayed against them was far larger than they had realized. For every White Walker that stood before them, there were dozens or hundreds of whites in the darkness beyond. And as the battle continued, those whites came shambling forward. The dead had no fear. They felt no pain. A white missing an arm or a leg or even half its torso would continue to advance until it was hacked to pieces or burned to ash. They wore the faces of friends and family of those who had fallen earlier in the battle or in previous encounters. To fight them was to fight memory itself, to strike down the familiar features of loved ones over and over again until the mind threatened to break under the strain. The settlement fell before midnight. The Red Crow died fighting, her dragonglass dagger lodged in the shattered remains of a walker, her body frozen solid in the moment of her defiance. Of the 300 who had stood to fight, perhaps 24 escaped into the night, fleeing south with tales of the horror they had witnessed. The rest fell and rose again, adding their numbers to the army of the dead, and the darkness continued its march southward. This pattern repeated itself across the north in those early days and weeks. Settlements would receive warnings, would prepare as best they could, and would fight desperately against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Some battles lasted longer than others. Some settlements managed to kill a walker or two before being overwhelmed. A few communities, those fortunate enough to possess significant quantities of dragonglass, or to discover that fire could permanently destroy the whites, held out for days or even weeks. But one by one, they fell. The White Walkers were learning as well. They adapted to the defenses that worked against them. They began to attack at night, when the darkness was deepest, when fire provided less advantage. They sent the Whites forward first, using them to exhaust the defenders before the Walkers themselves engaged. They demonstrated a tactical sophistication that suggested they retained or had developed military intelligence, that they understood siege warfare and the value of attrition. And always, with each settlement that fell, their army grew larger. The true horror of the Whites lay not just in their numbers or their fearlessness, but in their diversity. Any dead thing could be raised: men, women, children, even animals. Bears and wolves and elk, all rising with those glowing blue eyes, all serving the cold masters who commanded them. The elderly and the young, the strong and the weak, all became equally dangerous once death and the Walker's magic claimed them. A child could kill a warrior if that child felt no pain and fought with the single-minded purpose the Whites possessed. Perhaps worst of all was the psychological toll. To see one's family and friends and neighbours rise again as enemies, to be forced to burn or dismember the bodies of loved ones, to ensure they couldn't be used against the living. This broke many, as surely as the cold or the weapons of ice. The North had always been a hard land, but its people had been proud of their resilience, their ability to endure. They had survived countless harsh winters, had built their civilization in a place where the very elements seemed hostile to human life. But this was different. This was not a natural winter that would eventually pass, not a season to be endured until spring returned. This was something unnatural, something wrong at the most fundamental level. And deep in their bones, the people of the North began to understand that everything they knew about winter had been merely preparation for this, for a winter that might never end. As the weeks turned into months, the sun began to behave strangely. It rose later each day and set earlier, as if fleeing from what was happening below. The days grew shorter and the nights longer, until it seemed that darkness reigned more often than light. This phenomenon was not limited to the North. Across all of Westeros, and indeed across the known world, people looked to the sky and saw the sun diminishing, saw the darkness growing, saw the stars themselves seeming to dim and withdraw. The long night had truly begun. In the southernmost settlements that still stood, those that hadn't yet been reached by the advancing cold, a desperate realization was taking hold. The White Walkers were not simply raiders who would take what they wanted and leave. They were not an invading army that sought to conquer and rule. They were something far more implacable and far more terrible. They were winter incarnate. They were death itself made manifest, and they wouldn't stop until everything that lived and breathed and felt warmth had been extinguished. The stories that reached the southern kingdoms, carried by refugees who had fled to the north, were met with skepticism and disbelief. The Marsh Kings and the Barrow Kings, the rulers of what would become the Riverlands and the Vale, all received reports of what was happening in the far north, and most dismissed them as the exaggerations of frightened wildlings. Dead men walking, monsters made of ice, a winter that swallowed the sun. These were the ravings of superstitious barbarians, surely, not threats that civilized men need concern themselves with. But as the darkness spread south, as the cold crept into regions that had never known such bitter temperatures, as refugees continued to pour out of the north with increasingly desperate tales, denial became impossible. The White Walkers were coming. and they were bringing with them an army of the dead that grew larger with every battle, with every settlement that fell, with every desperate stand that ended in defeat. They were bringing a winter that seemed to have no end, a darkness that swallowed hope as surely as it swallowed the sun. The first men, who had conquered Westeros and made it their own, who had thought themselves masters of the land they had taken from the children of the forest, were about to learn a hard lesson in humility. There were forces in the world older and more terrible than their bronze and iron, older than their kingdoms and their ambitions. And one of those forces was descending upon them now, implacable and unstoppable, driven by a hunger for cold and death that could not be reasoned with or negotiated away. The age of heroes was being tested as it had never been tested before. And as the darkness descended, and the cold swept south, and the dead rose to march against the living, the question that haunted every mind was simple and terrible. Could anyone survive this? Or would the long night be the last night, the final darkness before all warmth and life were extinguished forever from the world? The answers would come in blood and ice and courage and sacrifice, in alliances that should have been impossible, and heroism that would echo through the ages. But first, humanity would have to face the full horror of what had been unleashed, would have to stare into the glowing blue eyes of their own mortality, and would have to decide whether to fight or to surrender to the endless winter that was now upon them. The worst, as terrible as things already were, was still to come. In the darkest hours, when all hope seems lost and the world itself appears to be ending, there is a peculiar quality to the human spirit, or perhaps to the spirit of all thinking beings, that refuses to accept defeat. Even as the darkness spread across Westeros, even as settlement after settlement fell to the cold and the dead, even as the sun grew weaker and the nights longer, there were those who chose to stand and fight. These were the heroes of the long night, and their names and deeds have echoed through 8,000 years of history, though the line between truth and legend has grown so blurred that separating one from the other is all but impossible. The consolidation of resistance did not happen quickly or cleanly. In the early stages of the long night, each kingdom, each settlement, each group of survivors fought their own desperate battles in isolation. Communication had broken down as the cold advanced. Ravens froze in flight. Riders were caught by the darkness and the whites, and the sheer chaos of communities falling and people fleeing made any coordinated response impossible. But gradually, as the full scope of the threat became undeniable, as even the southernmost kingdoms saw their skies darken and their temperatures plummet, the scattered resistance began to coalesce. Refugees from fallen settlements carried not just tales of horror, but also crucial knowledge. What weapons worked against the others, how to fight the whites, what strategies provided even temporary success. This information spread from survivor to survivor, from warrior to warrior, and slowly, painfully, humanity began to learn how to fight back. The dragonglass proved to be the key. The children of the forest, emerging from their hidden groves and caves, revealed that they possessed stores of the obsidian that could shatter the White Walkers. They shared this knowledge freely now, for they understood better than anyone that this was their mistake to rectify, their creation to destroy. The irony was bitter. The same substance they had used to create the first White Walker was the very thing that could unmake them. Mining operations were established in the far south, in places where the cold had not yet reached, to extract dragonglass in quantities sufficient to arm an army. Smiths worked day and night to fashion the brittle volcanic glass into weapons, daggers and arrowheads primarily, for the material could not hold an edge for swords or spears of any length. But even a small blade could shatter a White Walker if driven true, and so every ounce of dragonglass that could be mined was shaped and distributed to those who would stand against the darkness. It was in this period of desperate preparation that the figure known as the last hero emerged, though whether that was his true title, or one given to him by later generations, remains unclear. The accounts of his life and deeds are fragmentary, preserved primarily in the tales told by the descendants of the first men, especially in the north, where the memory of the Long Night remained strongest. Old Nan's tale, told centuries later to young Brandon Stark in the halls of Winterfell, provides the most complete version that has survived. According to her account, the last hero set out into the darkness with 12 companions, his best warriors, his closest friends, men who had proven themselves in countless battles against the Whites, and possibly even against the White Walkers themselves. He took with him a horse and a dog, and he went north, into the very heart of the darkness, seeking something that the legends do not clearly specify. Some say he sought the children of the forest, to learn from them the secret of how to defeat their creation. Others claim he was searching for a weapon, some artifact of the Age of Dawn that could turn back the tide of ice and death. Still others suggest he was looking for the White Walkers themselves, seeking to understand them, to perhaps find some way to negotiate, or to discover a weakness that could be exploited. The journey was hell incarnate. One by one his companions fell. The cold took some, freezing them solid where they stood. The Whites claimed others, overwhelming them in the darkness. The White Walkers themselves hunted the party, stalking them through the frozen waste with patient malevolence. His horse died, then his dog, until the last hero was alone in the darkness, weaponless, his sword having shattered from the cold, with only his determination and his purpose driving him forward through the endless night. What happened at the end of his journey, the tales do not clearly say. Old Nan's version ends with him finding the children of the forest, though how this encounter led to the eventual defeat of the White Walkers is left maddeningly vague. Some versions suggest he learned a great secret, some weakness in the magic that animated the others. Other accounts hint that he made some kind of bargain, though with whom and at what cost is never specified. A few whisper that he himself became something other than human, that he took into himself some power that allowed him to stand against the cold, though these versions are usually dismissed as embellishments. What is certain is that the last hero's journey, whatever its ultimate conclusion, became a symbol of resistance. His willingness to venture into the heart of darkness alone, to sacrifice everything in the search for a way to save his people, inspired others to stand firm when every instinct screamed at them to flee. His tale was told and retold around the fires of besieged settlements, and it gave courage to those who had none left. But the last hero was not the only figure of legend to emerge from the long night. Far to the east, in the lands beyond the narrow sea, in the ancient civilizations of Essos, another hero rose to face the darkness. Azor Ahai, as he was known in the distant east, was a warrior, and perhaps a priest of Halor, the Lord of Light, though the faith in its current form may not have existed in the same way during the Long Night. The accounts from Yitai and Ashai speak of him as a chosen champion, selected by prophecy to stand against the darkness that had descended upon the world. For yes, the Long Night was not limited to Westeros. The darkness and the cold spread across the known world, though whether this was because the White Walkers themselves travelled so far, or whether their presence somehow affected the world on a more fundamental level, none can say with certainty. The legend of Azor. Ahai is inseparable from the tale of Lightbringer, the sword he wielded. According to the ancient texts preserved in the Shadowlands beyond Ashai, Azor Ahai laboured for 30 days and 30 nights to forge a sword capable of fighting the darkness. When he was done, he tempered it in water, but the blade shattered. He was not deterred. He began again, working for 50 days and 50 nights, and this time he tempered the blade by plunging it into the heart of a lion. But, again, the steel shattered. For the third and final attempt, he laboured for 100 days and 100 nights. But this time, he understood that the sword required a different kind of tempering, a sacrifice of the deepest and most terrible kind. He called his wife, Nissa, to him, and though she knew what he intended, though tears streamed down her face, she bared her breast. Azor Ahai drove the sword into her living heart, her soul combining with the steel, and in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, Lightbringer was born, a blade that burned with the light and heat of the sun itself, a weapon that could stand against the cold and the darkness. The historicity of this tale is deeply questionable. The elements are too mythic, too archetypal to accept at face value. No sword, regardless of how it was forged, could literally burn with the light of the sun. Such a thing defies the natural laws that even magic must generally conform to. And the notion that killing one's beloved wife would imbue a blade with mystical power seems more like religious allegory than historical fact. Yet, something happened in the East during the Long Night, something significant enough that the memory of Azor Ahai and his sword persisted through 8,000 years. Whether there was truly a warrior by that name, whether he carried a sword that shone with light, perhaps a blade of Valyrian steel, though that civilization would not rise for thousands of years yet, or perhaps simply a sword heated in a forge and wielded while still glowing, creating the illusion of a burning blade, or whether the entire tale is metaphorical, representing some other kind of victory over darkness. The truth has been lost to time. What matters is that in the distant East, just as in Westeros, heroes rose to fight. Warriors and wise men, queens and common soldiers, all united against a threat that transcended the usual boundaries of nation and culture. In Yiti, they speak of a god on earth who led the defense of the great empire, who rallied armies and held the line against the darkness. In Ashai, the Shadowbinders claim their predecessors fought with magic and fire, burning away the cold and the dead with sorceries that have since been lost. The question of whether these were truly separate heroes fighting the same threat across vast distances, or whether the legends have conflated multiple different crises into a single mythic event, remains a subject of debate among Meisters. Some argue that the Long Night was a global catastrophe affecting all of the known world simultaneously. Others suggest that the tales from the East describe different events entirely, local disasters that happened to coincide chronologically with Westeros's Long Night, and that later generations combined them into a single narrative. But for those who lived through it, such scholarly debates would have been irrelevant. What mattered was survival, and survival required heroes, not just great warriors and wise leaders, but ordinary people who found within themselves the courage to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. In Westeros, the resistance began to organize more effectively as the long night wore on. The surviving lords and kings, realizing that their petty rivalries meant nothing in the face of extinction, began to set aside their differences. Armies were raised, not to fight each other, but to stand united against the common enemy. The children of the forest sent their greatest warriors and most powerful greenseers to aid humanity, sharing not just their dragonglass, but their knowledge of the old magic, teaching humans how to use the weirwood network to coordinate across vast distances, how to sense the approach of the cold, how to identify and target the White Walkers themselves, rather than wasting strength fighting their endless white servants. Brandon the Builder, who would later become famous for constructing the wall, was already a figure of significance during the long night. Some tales suggest he was a companion of the last hero, one of the 12 who set out into the darkness, and that he was the only one besides the hero himself to return. Other accounts place him in the south, organizing the construction of fortifications and refugees, using his legendary skill with stone and engineering to create strongholds that could withstand siege by the dead. There were others whose names have been preserved, though their specific deeds have often been lost or conflated with myth. Joramun, a king beyond the wall, who united the free folk and led them in desperate battles against the others. Durin Godsgrief, in the Stormlands, who held Storm's End against the darkness when the cold reached even that far south. The Grey King of the Iron Islands, who some say sailed north with his longships to raid the White Walkers' forces, as impossible as that sounds. But perhaps more important than any individual hero were the countless unnamed warriors, the ordinary men and women who stood watch through the long darkness, who fought and died and rose again as whites, who sacrificed everything so that others might live. Every stand made, no matter how brief, bought time. Every White Walker shattered, no matter the cost, reduced the enemy's ability to raise more dead. Every settlement that held for even a few extra days allowed more refugees to flee south, more knowledge to be preserved, more dragonglass to be mined and distributed. The turning point, when it came, was not a single glorious battle, but rather a gradual shift in momentum. The living learned to fight effectively against the dead. Fire and dragonglass became common rather than rare. Tactics evolved. Fortifications were designed specifically to defend against an enemy that felt no fear and no pain. The White Walkers, for all their power and intelligence, began to lose more of their number than they could easily replace. For creating a White Walker was evidently more difficult than simply raising a white. And perhaps most importantly, the alliance between humanity and the children of the forest grew stronger. The children, driven by guilt and desperation, taught the first men secrets that they had never before shared. How to work certain kinds of magic through the weirwoods. How to strengthen fortifications with spells woven into the very stone. How to create wards that the White Walkers could not easily pass. Whether they also revealed the full truth of how the others had been created is unclear, but they certainly shared enough knowledge to give humanity a fighting chance. The role of prophecy during this period cannot be overlooked, though it must be viewed with appropriate skepticism. Multiple accounts speak of prophetic visions that guided the heroes of the Long Night, of greenseers peering into possible futures to identify the paths that led to survival. The legend of Azor Ahai includes a prophecy, the specifics of which vary between versions, but generally involve a chosen hero, born amidst salt and smoke, destined to wake dragons from stone and wield a burning sword against the darkness. Whether such prophecies were genuine glimpses of the future, or simply stories created after the fact to give meaning to chaotic events, they served a purpose. They gave people hope. And hope, in the depths of the long night, was as vital a resource as dragonglass or fire. As the conflict stretched from months into years, as the darkness continued and the sun remained dim and distant, a kind of grim determination settled over the defenders. They had learned to survive in the darkness, to fight in conditions that should have been impossible, to endure a winter that showed no signs of ending. They had paid a terrible price. Uncounted thousands had died. Entire regions had been depopulated. The landscape of the north had been transformed into a frozen wasteland. But they had not been destroyed. They had not surrendered. And slowly, gradually, they were beginning to believe that they might actually win. The question now was not whether they could survive, but whether they could push back. Could they drive the White Walkers north, back to the frozen wastes from which they had emerged? Could they find some way to end this threat permanently? Or would they be forced to simply endure it, generation after generation, until the long night finally ended on its own? The answers would come in fire and blood, in magic and sacrifice, in the greatest battle that the known world had ever seen or would ever see again. The heroes had risen, the resistance had organized, and the stage was set for the final confrontation, for the battle for the dawn, when humanity and the children of the forest would stand together one last time against the darkness and the cold, and determine once and for all whether the world would belong to the living or to the dead. The long night had lasted a generation, or so the tales claim, though what constitutes a generation when the sun barely rises and the seasons have lost all meaning is a question that cannot be easily answered. Children had been born who had never seen true daylight, who knew only the endless twilight and the bitter cold. Elders who remembered the world before the darkness came had grown old and died, and still the winter continued. But something was shifting. The defenders had learned, had adapted, had survived long enough to turn survival into resistance, and resistance into counterattack. The alliance between the first men and the children of the forest, born of desperation and mutual guilt, had grown into something more substantial. A coordinated force capable of strategic thinking on a scale that matched the White Walkers' own tactical sophistication. The exact location of what would come to be known as the Battle for the Dawn is lost to history. Some accounts place it in the far north, near the lands of Always Winter themselves, suggesting that the living had pushed the others back to their point of origin. Other tales locate it further south, at what would become the site of the Wall, implying that this was humanity's last stand, the final line that could not be allowed to break. Still other versions speak of multiple great battles occurring simultaneously across a wide front, the outcome of each influencing the others in ways that determined the final result. What we know from the fragments that have survived is that the living, after years of defensive warfare, finally gathered their strength for a decisive offensive. This was not a single army, but a coalition of forces that would have seemed impossible in any other age. The first men kings had set aside their territorial disputes and ancient grudges. The free folk had united under leaders who understood that freedom meant nothing if the world itself was consumed by ice, and the children of the forest had committed the last of their strength to the battle, knowing that if humanity fell, they would follow swiftly after. The army that marched north, or that held position and awaited the enemy's approach, was unlike anything the world had seen before. At its core were the warriors of the first men, armoured in bronze and iron, carrying weapons tipped with dragonglass, or, in rare cases, with a strange dark metal that held an edge unlike any other. These weapons, which would later be called Valyrian steel, though Valyria itself had not yet risen, were gifts from the children of the forest, forged through processes that combined metalworking with the old magic. They could cut through the White Walkers' ice armor and shatter their frozen flesh as effectively as dragonglass, though how the children had created them, and why so few existed, even then remains a mystery. Alongside the human warriors stood the children themselves, small figures in green and brown who seemed insignificant compared to the armoured men around them, but whose power was not to be measured in physical stature. The Greenseers among them had prepared for this battle, had looked into countless possible futures, and identified the paths that led to victory, or, at least, to survival. They understood the cost that would have to be paid, understood that many of them would not see the dawn they were fighting for. But they had made their choice. This was their mistake to rectify, their creation to destroy, and they would spend everything they had to see it done. The White Walkers came as they always had, with the cold preceding them like a wave, with the darkness gathering around them like a cloak, with their army of the dead marching in terrible silence. But this time the living were ready. The battle began not with a dramatic charge or a clash of arms, but with fire. The defenders had learned that fire was their greatest weapon against the whites, and they had prepared accordingly. Great pyres had been built, soaked in oil and pitch, ready to be ignited at a moment's notice. Archers with fire arrows stood ready, their shafts wrapped in cloth and prepared to carry flame into the ranks of the dead. The children of the forest had worked magic into the very earth, creating channels where fire could flow like water, barriers of flame that would cut through the white formations and create killing grounds. When the army of the dead came into range, the fires were lit. The effect was devastating. Whites by the hundreds, by the thousands, were consumed by flames that seemed to burn hotter and brighter than natural fire should, enhanced by the children's magic and by the desperate will of those who had kindled them. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a horrible stench that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for the rest of their lives. But the whites felt no pain, no fear, and those that survived the flames simply marched through and continued their advance. Behind the wall of fire and the ranks of burning dead, the White Walkers observed with their cold, alien intelligence. They had learned, too, had adapted their tactics over the years of warfare, and they did not simply throw their forces away as they might have in the early days of the Long Night. They probed the defences, searching for weaknesses, sending waves of whites to test the living's resolve and drain their resources. The first major assault came at what must have been dawn, though the sun was so dim and distant that it provided little more light than a full moon might have done. The whites came in a mass that seemed endless, climbing over, their own fallen, reaching out with grasping hands that cared nothing for the flames that consumed them. And behind them, patient and terrible, came the White Walkers themselves. The fighting was brutal and chaotic in a way that earlier battles had not been. Both sides understood that this was the culmination of everything that had come before, that there would be no retreat, no regrouping, no tomorrow if the battle was lost. The defenders fought with a desperation born of years of suffering and loss. They fought for their children who had never seen the sun properly, for their dead who deserved better than to be raised as slaves, for their world that had been stolen by the cold and the darkness. The White Walkers, for their part, fought with the relentless patience of winter itself. They couldn't be intimidated, could not be demoralized, could not be made to break and flee. When the living managed to bring down one of the others with dragonglass or enchanted steel, all the wights that Walker had raised fell as well. Sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. But there were always more walkers, always more dead to raise, always more cold, pressing in from all sides. The greenseers of the children worked magic during the battle, weaving spells that had not been used since the wars against the first men, calling upon powers that drained them until they collapsed, reaching through the weirwood network to coordinate the defense and to strike at the White Walkers from unexpected angles. Some accounts speak of the earth itself rising up to swallow wights, of trees coming alive to crush the dead in their branches, of blizzards being turned back against those who commanded them. How much of this is truth and how much is embellishment added by later generations, no one can say with certainty. But something happened during that battle, some working of magic on a scale that has not been seen in the world since, and the cost of it was terrible. The children, channeling so much power through themselves, began to die. Not in battle against the Whites or the Walkers, but simply from the effort of wielding magic that was too great for mortal flesh to contain. They burned out like candles in a storm, one after another, until the survivors were so few that they could be counted on two hands. But their sacrifice bought time and space, created opportunities for the human warriors to strike at the White Walkers, to thin their numbers and reduce their ability to command the endless horde of the dead. It was in the midst of this chaos that the last hero is said to have fulfilled whatever purpose his journey into the darkness had served. The tales are frustratingly vague about what exactly happened. Some speak of him confronting a leader among the White Walkers, a figure taller and more terrible than the rest, wearing a crown of ice and radiating cold that could freeze a man solid at 20 paces. Whether this figure was the original White Walker, the first one created by the children's ritual, or simply the strongest among them, the accounts do not agree. What the legends do say is that the last hero, armed with knowledge gained from the children of the forest, and with a blade forged for the specific purpose of ending the long night, struck down this leader. And when the leader fell, something changed. The cold that had gripped the world for a generation began to recede. The darkness that had swallowed the sun started to lift. The White Walkers, whether through some magical connection to their fallen leader, or simply through a loss of coordination and purpose, began to retreat. This is where the tale becomes most frustratingly incomplete. Did the last hero's action truly end the threat, or did it simply provide the opening that allowed the living to finally gain the upper hand? Did all the White Walkers die in that moment, or did they merely withdraw, falling back to the lands of always winter to wait and gather their strength for some future return. The accounts conflict, and perhaps the survivors themselves, did not know the truth of what had happened in the chaos of battle. What is certain is that the tide turned. The whites, no longer being raised as quickly as they fell, were gradually overwhelmed by fire and dragonglass. The remaining White Walkers, fewer in number and apparently less coordinated than before, were hunted down by warriors who had spent years learning how to fight them. The cold began to recede, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed, as if the unnatural winter had been held in place by the others' presence, and now, with them gone or greatly diminished, the natural order was reasserting itself. The role of Azor Ahai in all of this remains unclear. If he was a historical figure rather than a myth, and if the Long Night truly affected both Westeros and the distant East simultaneously, then presumably he was fighting his own battle against the darkness thousands of leagues away. The legends from Yitai speak of him leading a great host against an army of demons. Possibly the White Walkers, possibly whites, possibly some other manifestation of the darkness that had descended upon the world. They say he wielded Lightbringer, the sword forged from his wife's sacrifice, and that its burning blade cut through the darkness like the sun, breaking through clouds. The correlation between the timing of his supposed victory and the end of the long night in Westeros is too perfect to be entirely coincidental, which has led some maesters to speculate that Azor Ahai and the last hero were actually the same person, that the tales have been split and transformed by cultural differences and the passage of time. Others argue that if the Long Night was truly a global event, then multiple heroes in different parts of the world might have achieved their victories simultaneously, each one contributing to the final defeat of the darkness. Or, more skeptically, it is possible that the entire Azor Ahai legend is a later creation, inspired by garbled accounts of the Long Night in Westeros, but not actually connected to those events in any historical sense. The Masters debate these questions endlessly, but the truth is that we simply do not have enough reliable information to reach a definitive conclusion. What we do know is that the battle for the dawn, whatever its precise nature and location, marked the end of the long night. The darkness lifted, the sun returned to its normal strength, and the impossible cold that had gripped the world for a generation finally released its hold. Spring came, tentatively at first, as if the world itself was uncertain whether the winter was truly over, but then, with increasing confidence, as green shoots pushed through the snow and the ice began to melt. But the victory had come at a cost that would shape Westeros for all the ages that followed. The casualties were beyond counting. Entire regions had been depopulated. Settlements that had stood for generations were now empty ruins. Families and bloodlines had been wiped out completely. The North, which had borne the brunt of the long night, was devastated. More than half its population lost, its infrastructure destroyed, its survivors traumatized by years of constant warfare against an enemy that should not have existed. The children of the forest had paid an even steeper price. Already in decline before the long night began, they had spent themselves utterly in the effort to stop the threat they had created. Of the thousands who had existed before, perhaps only hundreds remained, and many of those were wounded or weakened beyond recovery. They retreated into the deepest forests, into caves and hollow hills, places where humans rarely ventured, and they would never again take an active role in the affairs of Westeros. The psychological damage was perhaps as severe as the physical. An entire generation had grown up knowing only darkness and cold and death. They had learned to fight as children, had seen their parents and siblings fall and rise again as enemies, had lived with the constant knowledge that each day might be their last. How does a civilization recover from such trauma? How do you rebuild not just homes and farms, but the very sense of security and normality that makes human society possible? And overhanging all of it was a question that no one wanted to ask, but that everyone was thinking. Would it happen again? The White Walkers had been driven back, perhaps destroyed, but no one was certain. The darkness had lifted, but would it return? Winter would come again, as it always did in the natural cycle of seasons, but would it bring with it that unnatural cold, those glowing blue eyes, that army of the dead? It was in response to this fear, this uncertainty, this desperate need to ensure that the long night could never be repeated, that Brandon the Builder would propose his greatest work, a wall stretching from the western coast to the eastern mountains, 700 feet high and imbued with magic that would keep the cold and the dead at bay. The wall would take years to build and would require both the engineering genius of the first men and the magical knowledge of the remaining children of the forest. But that is a story for the aftermath, for the world that emerged from the long night. For now, in the immediate wake of the battle, the survivors simply tried to comprehend what they had endured and what they had achieved. They had stood against the darkness and survived. They had faced extinction and refused to submit. They had fought for the dawn, and the dawn had come. The long night was over. The age of heroes had proven itself worthy of the name. And though the world would never be quite the same, though the scars of what had happened would never fully heal, life would continue. Humanity would rebuild, would grow strong again, would spread once more across the lands that the darkness had nearly claimed. But they would never forget. The memory of the long night, of the White Walkers and their army of the dead, of the cold and the darkness that had nearly consumed the world, would be passed down through the generations. It would become legend and myth, would be told as a cautionary tale to children, would shape the culture and institutions of Westeros for millennia to come. For those who had lived through it, who had fought in the battle for the dawn and survived to see the sun return, the victory was bittersweet. They had won, yes, but at a cost that could never be fully reckoned. And always, in the back of their minds, was the knowledge that winter would come again. Perhaps not the same winter, perhaps not with the same terrible cold and darkness, but winter would always return. And when it did, would they be ready? When the sun finally broke through the endless night, those who remained could scarcely recognize the world they had fought to save. The landscape of the north had been transformed into something alien and desolate. Where once there had been forests, now stood fields of shattered, frozen trees, their branches snapped by the weight of ice that had accumulated over years of unnatural winter. Rivers that had flowed for millennia were choked with ice so thick that it would take seasons to melt. The earth itself seemed scarred, as if the very passage of the White Walkers had poisoned the land, leaving behind a barrenness that would require generations to heal. But more devastating than the physical destruction was the loss of life. The Maesters, attempting to calculate the toll in later years, estimated that 3/4 of the population of the North had perished during the long night. Some died in battle, cut down by whites, or frozen by the touch of the White Walkers. Others succumbed to starvation when their crops failed and their stores ran out during the endless winter. Still more simply froze to death in the darkness, unable to maintain fires or find shelter against the unnatural cold. Entire bloodlines had been extinguished. Houses that had ruled for generations were gone, their halls empty, their names surviving only in the memories of scattered survivors. Villages and towns that had stood since the age of dawn were abandoned, their populations either dead or fled south, never to return. The infrastructure of civilization, the roads, the granaries, the keeps and holdfasts, lay in ruins, and the survivors lacked the resources and the will to immediately begin rebuilding. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the living faced challenges that were in some ways more daunting than the war itself had been. They had to deal with the dead, not the whites, which had collapsed when their White Walker masters fell or fled, but the countless corpses that littered the battlefield and the abandoned settlements. These bodies had to be burned, for no one dared to simply bury them, not after years of seeing the dead rise again. Great pyres were built, and for weeks the sky was thick with smoke, as the fallen were consigned to flame. The survivors themselves were in desperate condition. Years of inadequate food, of constant stress and warfare, of living in conditions that should have killed them, had taken their toll. Disease spread through the refugee camps and the surviving settlements. Illnesses that would have been manageable in normal times became deadly when people were already weakened and malnourished. Healers worked themselves to exhaustion, but they could do only so much with the limited supplies and knowledge available. The psychological trauma ran even deeper. Children who had grown up during the long night knew nothing but war and darkness. They flinched at shadows, started at unexpected sounds, and some of them could not sleep without someone keeping watch, convinced that the dead would come again in the night. Warriors who had fought for years against an enemy that shouldn't exist struggled to return to normal life, haunted by memories of friends and family risen as whites, of the cold touch of White Walker's blades, of the hopeless feeling that the darkness would never end. And yet, slowly, painfully, the world began to heal. The first men, despite their losses, despite the devastation that had been wrought upon their civilization, began the work of rebuilding. It was Brandon of House Stark, already famous for his architectural achievements during the war, who emerged as the central figure in this reconstruction. Brandon the Builder, as he would come to be known, understood that physical reconstruction was necessary but not sufficient. The people needed more than new halls and repaired roads. They needed a sense of security, a belief that the horrors they had endured would never be repeated. And so Brandon proposed something unprecedented in scale and ambition: a wall. Not merely a defensive fortification like those that protected settlements throughout Westeros, but a barrier that would span the entire breadth of the north, from the Bay of Seals in the west to the Shivering Sea in the east, a distance of some 300 miles. It would be built of ice and stone, reinforced with magic provided by the last of the children of the forest, and it would stand 700 feet high, tall enough that no army could hope to scale it, thick enough that no force could break through. The proposal was met with skepticism by many. The resources required for such a project were staggering. The North had barely enough able-bodied workers to plant crops and repair the most basic infrastructure, let alone embark on a construction project that would take years, if not decades, to complete. The cost in labour and materials would be enormous, and all for a defensive work against an enemy that might have been completely destroyed, that might never return. But Brandon, with the support of the other surviving lords and with the backing of the children of the forest, persisted. He argued that the White Walkers had retreated, but not been destroyed, that they had withdrawn to the lands of Always Winter, where they might even now be gathering their strength for another assault. He pointed out that the free folk, those wildlings who had survived north of where the wall would stand, reported continued sightings of strange, cold, and unexplained disappearances in the far north. And perhaps most compellingly, he argued that the wall would serve not just as a physical barrier, but as a psychological one, a constant reminder and reassurance that the horrors of the long night would not come south again. The decision to build the wall was ultimately driven as much by fear and trauma as by rational calculation of military necessity. The survivors of the long night were desperate for anything that would make them feel safe, that would give them some measure of control over a world that had proven itself to be far more dangerous and unpredictable than they had ever imagined. If a wall 700 feet high was what it took to sleep peacefully at night, then they would build that wall, whatever the cost. Construction began within a year of the battle for the dawn. Brandon the builder himself oversaw the project, bringing to bear all the knowledge and skill he had accumulated during his life. But the wall was not simply a work of engineering. It was also a work of magic, and for this, the help of the children of the forest was essential. The remaining children, despite their own weakness and the losses they had sustained, committed themselves fully to the project. They understood, perhaps better than the humans did, that the wall had to be more than just stone and ice. It had to be imbued with protections that would prevent the White Walkers from simply walking around or through it, that would create a true barrier not just to physical passage, but to the cold magic that the others wielded. The exact nature of the spells woven into the wall has been lost to time. That children's magic was never something that could be easily explained or recorded in written form. It was worked through ritual and sacrifice, through connection to the weirwoods and the earth itself, through knowledge that had been passed down through countless generations of their kind, and that died with them when the last Greenseers finally passed from the world. What is known is that the wall incorporated elements that suggest deep magic at work. The ice from which it was primarily constructed never melted, even in the height of summer when the temperature south of the wall might reach sweltering heights. The wall seemed to resist the passage of certain creatures, not just whites and White Walkers, but other things as well, suggesting that the protections were broader than simply a defense against the specific threat of the others. And those who lived upon the wall, who maintained it and defended it, reported strange phenomena. Sounds in the ice at night, glimpses of faces in its frozen depths, a sense that the wall itself was somehow aware, somehow watching. But building the wall was only half of the solution. A barrier, no matter how tall or how well protected by magic, was useless unless there were people to defend it, to watch for threats from the north, and to respond if the White Walkers or any other danger emerged. And so, in conjunction with the wall's construction, Brandon and the other lords established what would become known as the Night's Watch. The founding of the Night's Watch was intended as something sacred, a military order dedicated to the highest possible purpose, the defense of the realm against the darkness. The first members of the watch were volunteers, veterans of the long night, who understood the threat better than anyone, and who were willing to dedicate their lives to ensuring it never returned. They took vows that bound them for life, swearing to hold no lands, take no wife, father no children, to wear only black, and to live and die in service to the realm. These vows weren't seen as punishments or sacrifices, at least not initially, but as honours. To be chosen for the Night's Watch in those early days was to be recognised as one of the finest warriors in Westeros, someone trusted with the most important duty that existed. The watch was exclusive, selective, taking only those who had proven themselves in battle, and who could be counted on to hold the wall no matter what came against it. Brandon established 19 castles along the wall's length, each positioned to allow the watch to patrol and defend the entire 300-mile span. These castles were built into the wall itself in some cases, carved from the ice and reinforced with stone and timber. They were designed to house garrisons large enough to respond to any threat, with stores sufficient to survive a siege, with walls and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for archers and clear sightlines for the watchmen who would keep vigil day and night. The largest and most important of these castles was Castle Black. Positioned roughly in the centre of the wall at the point where the King's Road, the great highway that would eventually connect the north to the southern kingdoms, met the wall. Castle Black became the headquarters of the Night's Watch, the seat of the Lord Commander who would lead the order, and the home of the largest garrison of brothers. To support the Night's Watch, Brandon and the other lords established the gift, a stretch of land south of the wall that was granted to the watch to provide food and resources. The new gift would be added later, doubling the land available to the watch and ensuring that they would never lack for sustenance. Lords throughout the north pledged to support the watch with men, supplies, and gold, recognizing that the defense of the wall benefited everyone. But perhaps most significantly, a practice was established whereby criminals and condemned men could be offered the choice between death or taking the black, joining the Night's Watch and serving out their days on the wall. This was intended as an act of mercy, a way for even the worst criminals to redeem themselves through service to a higher cause. A murderer or a rapist, by serving on the wall, could atone for their crimes by helping to defend the realm against a threat far worse than any human evil. In the early years, this practice worked as intended. Men who had made terrible mistakes were given a second chance, and many of them proved to be valuable members of the Watch, their past crimes forgotten in light of their service. The vows of the Night's Watch were meant to wipe clean all previous obligations and crimes. A man who took the black was reborn, his past self dying, and a new identity as a brother of the Watch taking its place. The free folk, those wildlings who lived north of the wall, initially presented a complication to the new order. These were people who had also fought against the White Walkers, who had also suffered during the long night, and who had as much right to the lands they inhabited as anyone else. But the decision was made, whether rightly or wrongly, that the wall would mark a boundary, and that those south of it would be under the protection and rule of the kingdoms of Westeros, while those north of it would be left to their own devices. This division created resentment that would last for millennia. The free folk saw the wall as an insult, a barrier built by southern lords who had no right to dictate where people could and could not live. They argued, not without justification, that they had fought against the darkness just as bravely as anyone else, that their ancestors had died in the same battles, and that they were being abandoned to face any future threat alone. Some wildlings did choose to come south before the wall was completed, accepting the rule of the northern kings in exchange for the protection the wall would provide. But many refused, valuing their freedom above security, unwilling to kneel to lords they did not recognize and whose authority they rejected. These free folk remained north of the wall, and over the generations, the cultural divide between them and the southerners would grow until they seemed almost like different peoples, despite their shared ancestry. The completion of the wall took years. Some accounts say a decade, others suggest even longer. But when it was finally finished, when the last stone was set, and the final spells were woven into its ice, the result was a structure unlike anything else in the known world. It stretched from sea to sea, a glittering blue-white barrier that could be seen from miles away, that dominated the landscape and proclaimed in its very existence that humanity had faced the darkness and survived, and that they would never allow themselves to be so threatened again. Brandon the Builder didn't live to see the wall fully completed. He died during its construction, worn out by years of ceaseless labor and the strain of coordinating such a massive project. But his legacy was secure. The wall would stand for 8,000 years and more, a testament to his vision and his determination, a constant reminder of the long night and the price that had been paid to end it. The Night's Watch in those early years numbered in the thousands. Some accounts claim 10,000 men garrisoned in the 19 castles, though this number seems inflated and was likely never sustained. But even if the true number was half that, it represented a significant military force, well-trained, well-equipped, and utterly dedicated to their purpose. They kept the watch, as they had sworn to do. They patrolled the wall, ranging north to scout for threats, maintaining the castles and the infrastructure, training new recruits in the arts of war. And they waited, always watching the north, always wondering if the cold would come again, if the glowing blue eyes would appear in the darkness, if the long night would return. As the years passed, and the threat did not materialize, as the memory of the long night began to fade from living experience into history, and from history into legend, the nature of the Night's Watch would slowly change. The sacred order of the finest warriors would gradually become a dumping ground for criminals and unwanted sons. The 19 castles would be reduced to 3 as the watch's numbers dwindled, and the true purpose of the wall would be forgotten by all but a few. But that decline lay far in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the long night, in the years when the wall was rising stone by stone and the survivors were rebuilding their shattered world, the Night's Watch represented humanity's determination never to be caught unprepared again. The men who wore the black were heroes, their service honored, their sacrifice recognized. The wall stood as both monument and warning, a reminder of what had been, endured, and a promise that it would never be forgotten. Behind its protection, civilization could rebuild. The North, devastated as it was, could begin to recover. Children could grow up without fear of the cold and the darkness, could live normal lives, could dare to hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. The age of heroes was ending, transitioning into something new, an age where the great deeds were in the past, where the stories told around hearthfires were of ancestors' bravery rather than current adventures. But that was perhaps as it should be. The survivors of the long night had earned their peace, had paid for it in blood and suffering beyond measure. And if the price of that peace was eternal vigilance, if it required a wall 700 feet high, and an order of men sworn to watch the darkness forever, then that was a price they were willing to pay. For they had seen what happened when humanity grew complacent, when the darkness was forgotten, when the ancient threats were dismissed as mere legend. They would not make that mistake again. Not while the memory of the long night remained, not while the wall stood, not while the Night's Watch kept their vigil. The darkness had come once, and it had nearly destroyed the world. If it ever came again, humanity would be ready. Or so they believed. But belief, as the long night had taught them, was not always enough. 8,000 years is a long time. Long enough for history to become legend, for legend to become myth, and for myth to become nothing more than children's tales told on cold winter nights. Long enough for the Great Wall, built to defend against an existential threat, to become simply a feature of the landscape. Its true purpose forgotten by all but a few scholars and the dwindling members of the Night's Watch, who still recite their ancient vows. Long enough for humanity to forget the price that was paid for their survival, and to dismiss the warnings of their ancestors as superstition. And yet, for all the forgetting, for all the ways in which the truth of the long night has been obscured by time and retellings, fragments of memory persist. In the songs sung by travelling bards, in the histories recorded by maesters in the citadel, in the tales whispered by old women to frightened children, the long night endures. Changed, simplified, often misunderstood, but not entirely lost. The maesters, those learned men of the citadel, who dedicate their lives to the pursuit and preservation of knowledge, have done what they can to record what is known of the long night. Archmaester Fomas devoted an entire tome to the subject. Archmaester Haradon wrote extensively about the battle for the dawn, and countless others have contributed their analyses and theories over the millennia. But even the maesters, for all their careful scholarship, must acknowledge that much of what they have written is speculation built on fragments, educated guesswork attempting to fill the vast gaps in the historical record. The problem is twofold. First, the long night occurred so long ago that the written records from that period are scarce to non-existent. The first men didn't have a written language during the Age of Heroes. Their knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation, and oral tradition, while powerful, is also malleable. Stories change in the telling. Details are added or removed, events are compressed or expanded, and over 8,000 years, even the most carefully preserved tales can drift far from their original truth. Second, much of what was recorded in later ages comes from sources whose reliability is questionable. The maesters write what they can based on legends collected from the north, from tales told by the free folk, from fragments of songs and stories that have survived through countless retellings. But how much of this material represents actual historical events? And how much is embellishment, metaphor, or outright fabrication? The line between history and story becomes impossible to discern when peering back across such a vast expanse of time. What the masters generally accept as fact about the long night can be summarized briefly. Approximately 8,000 years before Aegon's conquest, Westeros experienced a winter of unusual length and severity. This winter lasted a generation, though what exactly constitutes a generation when seasons are irregular is unclear, and was accompanied by a period of darkness when the sun seemed to diminish. During this time, some threat emerged from the far north that required a massive military response from the First Men and their allies. This threat was eventually defeated, and in the aftermath, the wall was constructed and the Night's Watch founded to ensure the threat could not return. That is the core of what can be stated with reasonable confidence. Everything else, the nature of the threat, the specific events of the war, the identities and deeds of the heroes involved, exists in a grey area between history and legend. Old Nan, the elderly servant in Winterfell whose stories entertained generations of Stark children, preserves a different kind of knowledge. Her tales are not the carefully analysed reconstructions of maesters, but the living tradition of the North, passed down through her family for who knows how many generations. When she speaks of the Long Night, she does not hedge with qualifications or acknowledge uncertainties. She tells the story as it was told to her, with all its impossible details intact. In Old Nan's telling, the White Walkers weren't metaphors or exaggerations, but real creatures of ice and cold, with glowing blue eyes and swords that shattered steel. The last hero truly set out with 12 companions and a dog and a horse into the frozen waste, and truly watched them die one by one until he alone remained. The dead truly rose to fight for the others, an army of corpses that felt no pain and knew no fear. And the darkness truly lasted a generation, with the sun hidden and the stars themselves dying in the sky. The question that has occupied scholars for millennia is this: which account is closer to the truth? Are the Maesters correct that Old Nan's tales are exaggerations of a bad winter, and perhaps a military conflict with some northern tribe or wildling confederation? Or is Old Nan's tradition preserving genuine historical memory that the Maesters, with their skepticism of magic and the supernatural, are too quick to dismiss? The existence of the wall suggests that something significant occurred. No one builds a barrier 700 feet high and 300 miles long simply to defend against human raiders or harsh weather. The resources required, the labour involved, the sheer ambition of such a project, all point to a threat that was perceived as existential, something that justified extraordinary measures in response. The Night's Watch, too, is evidence of the Long Night's reality, the Order's vows, their ancient mission, the way they were structured in the early centuries, all suggest that they were created for a specific purpose that went beyond simply defending against wildling raids. The fact that the Watch was once considered a sacred order, that service was seen as an honour rather than a punishment, implies that the original threat was real and terrible enough to justify such dedication. And then there is the wall itself. The masters who have studied its construction acknowledge that there is something unnatural about the structure, something that defies conventional explanation. The ice does not melt, even in summer. The foundations go far deeper than any engineer would consider necessary for a simple defensive fortification. And there are accounts, dismissed by many but persistent nonetheless, of strange phenomena associated with the wall, suggestions that it is more than simply ice and stone, that it incorporates magic or forces that modern understanding cannot adequately explain. If the wall truly is magical, if it truly was built with protections against supernatural threats, then the implication is clear. The supernatural threat must have been real. The masters cannot have it both ways. They cannot acknowledge the possibility that the wall incorporates magical defenses, while simultaneously dismissing the White Walkers as mere legend. The tales from the Far East add another layer of complexity to the puzzle. In Yitai, they speak of the Long Night as well, a period of darkness and cold when demons emerged from the Lion of Night and threatened to destroy the great empire of the Dawn. The god on earth, their ruler at the time, led the defense and eventually drove back the darkness, and the sun returned. In Ashai, the Shadowbinders tell of Azor Ahai and his burning sword, Lightbringer, forged through the sacrifice of his beloved Nissa, which he wielded to end the darkness. Are these accounts describing the same events that occurred in Westeros? The timing seems to match, approximately 8,000 years ago, a period of unusual darkness and cold that affected multiple continents simultaneously. But the details are different. The heroes have different names, and the cultural contexts are so distinct that it is difficult to determine whether we are truly looking at a single global catastrophe or at multiple separate events that have been conflated in later retellings. Some Meisters argue that the similarity of the tales from different cultures is evidence of diffusion, that the story originated in one place and spread to others, being adapted and changed to fit local contexts. Others suggest that the tales might describe independent events, local crises that happened to occur at roughly the same time, but that were not actually connected. Still, others maintain that the similarities point to a genuine global catastrophe, an event so massive and so terrible that it left its mark on cultures separated by thousands of miles of land and sea. The truth, as with so much about the Long Night, remains elusive. As the centuries and millennia passed, as the memory of the Long Night faded further and further into the past, the Night's Watch itself began to change in ways that reflected the forgetting. The order that had once been the finest warriors in Westeros, volunteers dedicated to a sacred purpose, gradually became something quite different. As the immediate threat failed to materialize, as generations passed without any sign of White Walkers or the darkness returning, the Watch's prestige began to decline. The turning point came gradually, over centuries rather than years. Lords became less willing to send their finest sons to the wall, when the threat seemed increasingly theoretical. The Watch began to accept criminals and condemned men not just as an act of mercy, but out of necessity, because volunteers were no longer sufficient to maintain the ranks. And as the quality of recruits declined, so did the reputation of the Order itself, a vicious cycle that accelerated over time until the Night's Watch became known primarily as a penal colony, a place where the realm sent its unwanted and its criminals rather than its heroes. Of the 19 original castles built along the wall, only 3 remained garrisoned by the time of Robert's rebellion and the events that followed. Castle Black at the centre, Eastwatch by the sea on the eastern coast, and the Shadow Tower in the west. These 3 held what remained of the Night's Watch, a force that numbered perhaps 1,000 men, where once there had been 10 times that number or more. The other 16 castles stood abandoned, slowly crumbling, home only to rats and memories. The Watch still kept their vigil, still recited their vows, still ranged north of the wall to scout for threats. But, increasingly, the threat they defended against was not White Walkers, but wildlings, the free folk who lived north of the wall. and who occasionally raided south for resources or attempted to cross the wall to escape the harshness of their lands. The Watch's purpose had been reduced from defending against an apocalyptic supernatural threat to border patrol, preventing human migration and raiding. The irony was bitter. The free folk, descendants of those who had also fought against the darkness during the long night, were now considered the enemy, while the true enemy, if it still existed at all, was forgotten, dismissed as legend and superstition. And yet, even as the Watch declined and the memory faded, there were signs that the old threat might not be as extinct as most believed. Ranging parties reported strange occurrences in the far north, disappearances, glimpses of movement in the frozen wastes, an increasing cold that seemed unnatural even for the lands beyond the wall. The free folk spoke of things waking in the night, of ancient evils stirring, of a winter coming that would be different from those that had come before. These reports were largely dismissed, attributed to wildling superstition or to the hardships of life in the harsh northern climate. But a very few, wondered if perhaps the old tales were not as fictional as most assumed, if perhaps the long night had not ended so much as paused, if perhaps the threat had merely withdrawn rather than been destroyed. This brings us to the realm of theories, of speculation that attempts to fill the gaps left by incomplete historical records, and to make sense of mysteries that have persisted for millennia. What follows is clearly speculation, interpretations of fragmentary evidence, attempts to construct coherent narratives from incomplete information. These are not established facts, but possibilities, theories that have gained currency among those who study the long night, and that deserve consideration even if they cannot be proven. One of the most significant theories concerns the Night King. This figure does not appear in the older tales of the long night itself, but rather in a separate legend that may or may not be connected. According to this legend, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, many years after the long night ended, fell in love with a woman with skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. He brought her back to the Night Fort, the largest of the castles on the wall, and declared himself king, with her as his queen. For 13 years they ruled, performing dark rituals and making sacrifices to the White Walkers, or perhaps becoming something akin to them. Eventually, the Night King, as he came to be called, was defeated by an alliance between the king in the north, a Stark of Winterfell, and Joramun, the king beyond the wall. His reign ended, his name was stricken from all records, and his very existence became a matter of debate among later historians. But some theorists propose a connection between this Night King and the White Walkers, the Long Night. Perhaps, they suggest, he was not simply a corrupt Lord Commander, but someone who had discovered secrets about the others, who had learned how to communicate with them, or even how to become one of them. Perhaps his reign was an attempt to resume the war that the Long Night had represented, to bring back the darkness that had been defeated. Or, perhaps, and this is more controversial, perhaps the Night King and the leader of the White Walkers during the Long Night were the same figure, and the tale of the 13th Lord Commander is a garbled memory of earlier events, chronologically misplaced in the retelling. The evidence for this theory is thin, based primarily on the similar descriptions of the Night King's queen and the White Walkers, the pale skin, the blue eyes, the cold that surrounded them. But it remains a popular theory among those who believe the White Walkers were real, and it suggests possibilities about their nature and origins that the conventional accounts do not address. Another significant area of speculation concerns the Stark bloodline and its connection to the events of the Long Night. The Starks of Winterfell have always been more than just one noble house among many. They are the oldest house in Westeros by their own accounting, descended from the first men and maintaining traditions, worshipping the old gods, keeping a godswood with a heart tree in their castle, that most other houses have long since abandoned. Moreover, there are persistent rumours and occasional confirmed instances of unusual abilities running in the Stark bloodline. Skin-changing, the ability to enter the minds of animals and control them, appears with some frequency among Starks and those of Stark descent. More rarely, there are accounts of green-seeing, the ability to see through the eyes of the weirwood trees, to glimpse past and future, to access the powers that the children of the forest once wielded. These abilities, some theorists argue, are not coincidental. They suggest that during the Long Night, perhaps as part of the pact that ended the war, or perhaps through intermarriage with the children of the forest, the Stark bloodline acquired some portion of the children's magic. This would explain both the Starks' fierce dedication to the old gods and their commitment to maintaining the wall and the Night's Watch. They, more than any other house, remember why these things matter, because the memory is literally in their blood. Taking this theory further, some propose that the Starks have a specific role to play in the defense against the White Walkers, that their abilities are not random, but purposeful, bred or granted specifically, to provide humanity with the tools needed to recognize and combat the threat if it should ever return. The famous Stark words, "Winter is coming," take on additional significance in this interpretation. They are not simply an observation about the climate, but a warning, a reminder that has been passed down through 8,000 years that the threat represented by winter, by the Long Night, has not been permanently defeated and may come again. The connection between Craster, the wildling who lived north of the Wall during the final years of the Targaryen dynasty and beyond, and the White Walkers has also generated considerable speculation. Craster was known to practice incest, fathering children on his own daughters, and it was whispered that he sacrificed his male children to the cold gods, or the White Walkers beyond the Wall. The Night's Watch knew of this practice, or at least suspected it, but tolerated Craster because his keep provided a valuable way station for rangers operating north of the Wall. If the reports about Craster are true, and rangers who visited his keep confirmed at least some of the details, then the implication is staggering. The White Walkers still existed, or had returned, and were accepting offerings of human infants. But why? Some theories suggest that the White Walkers need human children to create more of their kind, that the transformation that creates a White Walker must begin in infancy or youth. This would mean that Craster was essentially breeding stock for the others, providing them with the raw material to build their numbers. But this raises additional questions. If the White Walkers have been accepting offerings from Craster, possibly for decades, then where are the White Walkers that should have been created from these offerings? Why have they not revealed themselves? Are they gathering their strength in the far north, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or is there some other purpose to these sacrifices that we do not yet understand? The prophecy of the prince that was promised, sometimes conflated with the Azor Ahai legend from the east, represents another layer of mystery surrounding the Long Night and its potential return. According to various interpretations of this prophecy, a hero will be reborn, possibly literally, possibly metaphorically, to fight against a great darkness. This hero will be born of the line of Aerys and Rhaella, or alternatively born amidst salt and smoke, or perhaps waking dragons from stone. The prophecy is maddeningly vague and contradictory, existing in multiple versions with different details. Some theorists argue that the prince that was promised is meant to fight against the return of the White Walkers, that the prophecy originated during or shortly after the Long Night, as a prediction or promise that when the darkness returned, a hero would rise to oppose it. Others suggest that the prophecy has been misinterpreted, that it refers to some other threat entirely, or that it is simply religious mysticism with no historical basis. The prophecy gained renewed attention during the reign of Aegon V, when that king became convinced that the return of dragons to the world was necessary to fulfill the prophecy. His obsession led to the tragedy at Summerhall, where he and much of his family perished in a fire that he had apparently believed would hatch dragon eggs. Whether the prophecy was genuine or whether Aegon was simply a tragic figure grasping at mystical solutions to worldly problems remains an open question. One of the more disturbing theories about the Long Night and the White Walkers concerns the cyclical nature of their appearances. According to this theory, the Long Night was not a unique event, but rather the most recent, or perhaps the most severe, instance of a recurring phenomenon. Proponents of this theory point to ambiguous references in very old texts to previous periods of darkness and cold, to legends from before the Age of Heroes that speak of similar threats, to the possibility that the world has faced and survived the White Walkers multiple times over the course of its history. If this theory is correct, then the implication is chilling. The White Walkers cannot be permanently defeated, only driven back for a time. They will return, perhaps in cycles measured in thousands of years, perhaps when certain conditions are met, perhaps according to some pattern or purpose that human understanding cannot grasp. And when they return, the world will face the same existential threat that nearly destroyed it 8,000 years ago. The evidence for this cyclical theory is circumstantial at best. Vague references in texts so old that their reliability is questionable, patterns that might be coincidence, similarities between legends, or that might simply reflect the way stories evolve over time. But it persists, particularly among those who take the threat of the White Walkers seriously and who see in the current times, with reports of strange occurrences in the far north, with the sense that the world is approaching some kind of crisis, echoes of the conditions that preceded the Long Night. What can be said with certainty about the White Walkers' nature and motivations? Very little, unfortunately. If they were truly thinking beings, rather than simply magical constructs or natural forces, then they had purposes and goals that were never clearly communicated to humanity. Did they seek to destroy all living things, to conquer and rule, to simply expand the cold and the winter as far as possible? Were they acting according to their own will, or were they compelled by the magic that created them to behave in certain ways? The lack of any recorded communication between the White Walkers and humanity is significant. In all the legends of the Long Night, there are no accounts of negotiation, of parley, of any attempt by either side to understand the other. The war was fought with utter mutual incomprehension, each side treating the other as an implacable enemy to be destroyed rather than as an opposing force with whom terms might be reached. This suggests either that communication was impossible, that the White Walkers were so alien, so different in their nature and thinking that meaningful dialogue could not occur, or that the opportunity for communication was never seized, that both sides were too committed to war from the very beginning to consider alternatives. As the world approaches what some believe may be another turning point, another time of crisis, when the old threats might return, these theories and speculations take on new urgency. The Meisters in their citadel continue to debate the historical reality of the Long Night, with many maintaining that the supernatural elements are exaggerations. The Night's Watch, reduced to a shadow of its former glory, still keeps watch on the wall, though many of its members no longer truly believe in the purpose they serve. The free folk beyond the wall report increasingly frequent encounters with something in the far north, something that they fear in a way they fear nothing else. And in Winterfell, the Starks still repeat their ancient words. Winter is coming. If you see the Long Night differently after walking through its history, step by step, piecing together fragments of truth from layers of legend, you're not alone. The questions that surround this ancient catastrophe are as numerous as the answers are scarce. Was it a natural disaster that has been mythologized beyond recognition, or was it truly a supernatural threat that nearly destroyed the world? Were the White Walkers real? And if so, what were they? Creations of the children of the forest, as some legends suggest, or something else entirely? Did they retreat, or were they destroyed? And if they still exist, are they gathering their strength, even now, for another assault? These questions cannot be definitively answered with the evidence available. But what can be said is that something happened 8,000 years ago, something significant enough to scar the world and leave traces that persist to this day. The wall stands as proof of that, a monument to a threat that was taken seriously enough to justify extraordinary measures in response. And whether that threat is truly gone or merely sleeping, whether the darkness will return or whether the Long Night is truly ended, are questions that perhaps the current generation will have to answer for themselves. The Long Night, whatever its true nature, whatever the reality behind the legends, represents humanity's greatest test, a time when the world itself seemed to be ending, when all hope seemed lost, and when ordinary people found within themselves extraordinary courage and determination. They stood against the darkness. They fought for the dawn, and they won. If the darkness comes again, if the White Walkers are real and returning, then perhaps the greatest lesson of the Long Night is simply this: the world can be saved, but only if people are willing to fight for it, to sacrifice for it, to stand together against threats that seem insurmountable. The Age of Heroes earned its name in the depths of the Long Night, and if another such age is coming, then the heroes will have to rise again. Share your thoughts and your own theories in the comments below. What do you believe truly happened during the Long Night? Were the White Walkers real, or has legend transformed a harsh winter into something far more dramatic? And if they were real, do you think they'll return? If you'd like more journeys through the hidden corners of Westeros and beyond, through the mysteries that George R.R. Martin has woven into this rich and complex world, subscribe for more deep dives into the lore and history of A Song of Ice and Fire. The past holds secrets, and some of those secrets may be warnings about the future. Winter is coming, but what that truly means, perhaps we're only beginning to understand.